Hey folks, Weingart here, and this will be the last of the smacc lectures to go up on the EMCrit site until smacc Gold in March. This is the Mind of the Resuscitationist talk. It is a talk I like very much. It's case-based, and a big part of it is the placement of a Blakemore tube. And since I know most people don't have experience doing this, I actually created a video for how to place the Blakemore in a patient with esophageal bleeding. So I will place that on the EMCrit.org site on the show notes for this show, and I'll also put it into the iTunes feed. Sorry, this one's coming out a little late. It's because I'm at ACEP, and actually this deals with some of the topics I'm going to be speaking about. So I put an embargo on publishing this podcast and the Blakemore video until Thursday morning, and that's why you didn't have anything when you came in on Monday, except for a we. All right, Scott Weingart, get into Mind of the Resuscitationist.
Thank you. I'm just glad I'm preceding Cliff on this because he blows me away on these topics. So we're going to talk about the mind of the resuscitationist, which is an idea I came up with as to describe what you should be thinking about when you're taking care of sick patients, because it's more than just the clinical, as we discussed all day yesterday. It's also your mindset, your way of dealing with things. So on the podcast, I have the series Mind of the Resuscitationist, where I go through some of the stuff, and we're going to talk about a bit more today than I have up on the site. The disclaimer is I'm going to talk about a case. It's not a real case. It's a conglomeration of a whole bunch of cases from a whole bunch of different hospitals I've worked at because I don't want to get fired. All right, so let's start off with the way I start each shift. And the first precept of the resuscitationist is that resuscitationists mind their workspace. And when I try to explain this to my registrars, what I tell them is I went to culinary school for a bit, and all the culinary students were tattooed, pierced freaks. And they weren't freaks because they were tattooed and pierced, they were freaks because they'd go and shoot heroin during the break times. But all these gnarly characters, when they're actually working, would keep a meticulous workspace. Everything would be clean. They'd immediately be wiping down their station after each time they prepare something. And their food was just totally precise. And so if these gnarly, dangerous characters who are shooting smacc could keep their stuff so clean because they know it's what needs to be done, we should do the same, even though we're the free-spirited emergency medicine folk. So the first half hour of my shift is always spent putting away everything into its proper place, making sure we're entirely stocked, making sure everything is where it needs to be if a sick patient rolls through the door. Now, thankfully, I had time to complete that when a sick patient did roll through the door. And our patient was a patient who had been vomiting coffee ground emesis for the past 2 hours. He actually had an episode at triage, and they brought him into my resuscitation bay. Now, we got a little history. It turns out he has hepatitis C, not because he was shooting drugs, but because he, in his native country, got into a bad car crash, and they gave him a bunch of bad blood. Now, it doesn't really matter. We treat everyone the same, but it's nice to know when they have something that totally wasn't their fault. And he's now an end-stage cirrhotic. He's on the liver transplant list, and he's been having this upper GI bleeding as well as melenic stools. And his vital signs were okay. He was a little bit borderline hypotensive, 105/70. It was a little tacky at 105, but he looked pretty good. But the next precept is that resuscitationists trust their gut. And this guy, he just did not make me feel comfortable. And we decided we were going to protect his airway before anything else. And it was really trusting his gut because he had one of those great big bellies that you know can contain a world's worth of blood. So we're going to protect the airway. Now, the next idea is that resuscitationists are not above checklists. We realize that this is not condemning our clinical skills, but instead allows us to offload the things we could put on a checklist and we don't have to remember them, so we could be considering a broad-based picture of the situation instead and use that cognitive resource for things we don't need to waste on for things on the checklist. So we go through a checklist on every airway. It's up on the EMCrit site. Take a look and send me comments because it keeps getting continuously reiterated and made better. So we go through our checklist, and one of the things on there is consider an NG tube to get rid of that huge amount of blood that's just waiting to spill into the airway as we're intubating. Now, he didn't like that. He did not want an NG tube. It was very bothersome, and he's already feeling pretty sick. So we decided to do DSI solely for procedures, delayed sequence intubation. We give ketamine. We get done what we need to do, whether it's pre-oxygenation or NG tube placement. And only then, when everything's fully ready and we feel we are totally set, do we push our paralytic. So we pushed some ketamine. We saw its hemodynamic effects. We placed an NG tube. while we're doing that, my residents were making a suction-as-you-go endotracheal tube. And this is what that looks like. And it's a combination of just a few pieces you have lying around the hospital already. It's a bronchodapter and a meconium aspirator, like you'd use for the little neonates when they have meconium staining. And if you put those together and attach it to suction, you could actually put that on your endotracheal tube and feed a stylet through it. And now what you have is a setup that if the patient does vomit, you could avoid that situation where you get in there, you see a perfect view of the cords, and the mouth fills up with vomit. So what do? Well, you grab your Yankow, you put down your ET tube, you suction, suction, suction. Oh, you see the cords again? So you pick up your ET, and immediately it fills up. It drove me crazy. I hated that. So with this setup, you could actually suction with the ET tube you're going to place through the cords continuously. And so that way, when you get the glimpse, you just pop it through, and then just pull out the stylet and the pieces, and you're set to go. So we had that ready. And this is the next idea. A resuscitationist knows better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And because we had done this extensive setup, this checklist, the suction-as-you-go ET tube, it was a pristine intubation, and he didn't vomit. We had sucked out with that NG tube 4 liters of coffee ground material. So he's a patient who's been bleeding quite a bit. And so the better way of saying this is whenever you don't prepare is when things go to hell. So his labs come back. He's obviously coagulopathic, his platelets are low, he's borderline anemic, and we're not feeling so great. And as to be expected, his blood pressure started dropping a bit after the intubation. So he starts going downhill. Now, a resuscitationist knows there's only 2 reasons to call a consult. The only 2 reasons you should be calling a consult are either they have a bed you want, or they could do a procedure you can't do. If you're calling for any other reason, if you're calling for knowledge, if you're calling because you don't quite know what's going on, you might be very disappointed with the results you get. When you call a consultant, it should already be within your mind what you want them to say and do. If you're looking to them for advice, then you have not truly mastered the craft, because the purpose of a critical care doctor is to know how to take care of every sick patient to the extent that they leave your department. Now, we needed this GI doctor because I can't do upper endoscopy. So a true resuscitationist runs the sick patients while most specialties run away from them. And GI has a tendency to tell me their patient is always either too well or too sick, and I rarely am capable of finding that patient that fits in the potential space between the two. But thankfully, today, this GI doctor was a resuscitationist. And when he heard their story, he said, "I'll be in there in 20 minutes." And I felt very good about that. We activated our massive transfusion protocol. It's all protocolized out. We don't have to think about how this happens. The blood comes. The platelets get set. The FFP gets thawed. At the same time, we're giving him octreotide and antibiotics, with the latter being a far greater evidence basis than the former for upper GI bleeds from varices. We start him on a ketamine drip because even though his blood pressure is unstable, I'm not going to leave him without pain control and without some degree of disassociation from the events going on. And ketamine is my go-to choice for the hypotensive patient. We give him tranexamic acid. We don't quite know if in this situation it's the way to go, but I don't think there's any harm, and I think there's a great potential for good. And then we look at his access. He has one 18 gauge and a 20 gauge, and that's not enough for this situation. So we want to get better access. And when performing procedures, the resuscitationist knows slow is smooth and smooth is fast. In the midst of a critical resuscitation, slow down as much as you could feel possible. Go as if you're in slow motion. And because of your episurge, what feels like you're moving at 1/4 speed is actually the perfect rate you should be doing your procedures at, because time gets sped up. And if you feel like you're going quickly, then you're absolutely being sloppy. So fast feels slow, sloppy feels fast. So the first thing we do is we replace that 20 gauge angiocath with a RIC, a rapid infusion catheter, which is just a wire exchange that allows us to put in a 6 French catheter through that 20 gauge that's already established, so you don't lose IV access. So now we have a great big bore IV line in his arm. We get an arterial line in to monitor, and we put in a triple lumen for extra access for any drips and meds we want to give. He's still bleeding. What now? He's already gotten 10 units of blood, he's gotten 8 units of FFP, and 2 packs of platelets, and he's still bleeding. So what now? Well, now we're going to go for a Blakemore until GI arrives. Now, one of the biggest precepts we talk about on the podcast is that amateurs talk strategy, experts talk logistics. And if you went through an oral board exam and I got to this point in the case, everyone, I think, would say, put in a Blakemore. But the difference between saying and doing is an enormous gap. So resuscitation is logistics. So if you've never, how many folks have placed a Blakemore? All right. And if you haven't raised your hand, you still need to be able to do it if it happened on your shift tomorrow. So you have to mentally work through how it would get done and then actually take out all the pieces to make that happen and see if you have them and you know where they are. Now, if you really want some perfect training on how to do this, I have a link in the presentation notes to a video on YouTube done by a GI doctor. That's fantastic. So you can find that at emcrit.org/smacc. But lacking this piece, you are logistically screwed in placing a Blakemore. They come in the package with nothing that allows you to occlude the actual tubes that pass into the balloons that you need to inflate. And what you quickly find is that this device, which took me a year to actually get our hospital order, is absolutely crucial for this procedure, for actually doing pleural lavage for a hypothermic patient you want to rewarm, for taking a central line that you've used to do a pericardiocentesis and attaching it to a Foley bag for drainage. This is essential and yet often absent. This is a Christmas tree to lure adapter. Now, we stock these except that day. They hadn't been there. And I had been remiss in checking that little draw. So resuscitationists improvise. And what I do with my free time on shifts is I just see what fits together. I'm always sticking things into other things. That doesn't sound good. And seeing what works, what fits, what matches. And I had already known from playing with this stuff that the little adapter on a NG tube that you put on the suction will actually fit into the tube of the Blakemore and perfectly fit the lure adapter of a three-way stopcock. So we used that instead. We were able to inflate the Blakemore, and now we have to secure it. These are my favorite tube securing devices. These are ETAD Hollisters. I take no money from this company. I tried them all, and this turned out the best. And what I discovered is if you open a second one and take off the piece that's actually attaching that ETT, you could slide that onto the rail as well, and now you have the ability to pull the 2 pounds of force you want and actually clamp that Blakemore down to that rail and not have to suspend weights from the ceiling, which just seems ridiculous. So now we have our Blakemore in and secured. I'm feeling pretty good. And the patient stabilizes. And we wipe our brows. We relax for just a bit, but not too much because we know this is still a tentative situation. And now the GI doctor arrives. He brings down his cart, and he tells me I have to take out the Blakemore. He can't scope with it in there. And, wow. Yeah, so I really did. I mean, I felt it in my belly. And so we took out the Blakemore, and the entire case went to hell. This is no exaggeration. He got in there with a scope, could see nothing, and the patient started pouring blood out from both his mouth and from below. And if you've ever been in this situation, I'm sure you all have, you know the smell of a melanic patient. And that smell is there, and blood is pouring to the ground to the point where it was actually coming up to our ankles. And I am covered at this point, as is the GI doctor, who continues to persevere. And we are pounding in the blood. And by this point, we had gotten up to 30 units of red cells, 28 units of FFP, countless packs of platelets. And we just kept going. And thankfully, I had the team I need to make this work. And it's my nurses and my registrars and all of us together. We had 5 people working on this patient, and they were all performing in synchrony because we had trained to do this. We knew our equipment. I was manning the level 1, changing them out as quick as they could hand me the cross-match products. And what we did is we just kept shooting for a MAP of 65. We gave, as our resuscitation fluid, a 1-to-1 PRBC and FFP. Each time his MAP would spike a bit, I'd get a little fentanyl in there to take care of vasoconstriction and know I'm perfusing the tissues. Every 4 units of blood, we'd hit him with a calcium chloride, and we put platelets and cryo in to try to match and keep up. And I was sweating. I was working. I don't understand how you could claim you're a resuscitationist in these situations and be sitting comfortably with a perfectly coiffed set of hair and your white coat maintained. Because when I'm in these situations, my back is aching and I could barely walk when the resuscitation's done. That's what resuscitationists do. And the GI doctor looked up at me and says, I can't do anything at all. So we grabbed the Blakemore again. We want to put it back in until the patient could get further therapies. And there was so much accumulated blood and crust in his mouth that it wouldn't go. And I kept trying to pass it, and it kept bending in on itself. It had softened from the previous. And we had sent someone to find another one, but they hadn't come back yet. And I'm just praying it would go in. And I don't know who I'm praying to, because I'm an atheist. But But you'll find that in these situations, you're always saying, please, please let this happen. And I don't know who we're asking if you don't believe in a higher power. So I just call it the resuscitation deity because I'm asking someone to please help me. And finally, with the help of a laryngoscope and some McGill forceps, it finally passed. And I just breathed a sigh of relief. And we reinflated and we resecured and he stabilized. Now we need tips. This is the solution to this problem. Except our IR doctor who was on doesn't do tips, and that's a problem. And so I called up the hospital administrator. Now, when I had given the first talk, I'd put this slide up, and I got a tweet saying that not every hospital administrator is like this. And I wrote back and said, yes, and none of them have sense of humor either. But that tweet was absolutely true, because this hospital administrator, when I called them up and told them the story, said, don't worry, I'm going to take care of this. And actually called around some other hospitals, found an IR doctor at another hospital willing to come to us and work at our place, got them emergency credentials to make it happen, and brought them in within a half hour. That's a hospital administrator. That's a resuscitationist. All right, so most conflicts like this are easy. Just do what's right for the patient. We'll figure out the other crap later. So the patient was stable, went to IR, got tips. After the case, we debriefed, because that's what you do. You talk it through. If there's any mistakes in a non-confrontational manner, you discuss it as a group. If it's something you feel truly egregious, you take that person aside and don't shame them in front of the team, and you figure it all out for next time. And then you go home and you agonize, no matter how well the case seemed to have went. You ask yourself, is there something that could have gone better? Is there something next time I could do to make this work at an even higher level? Patient went on to get a liver transplant. I lost touch with him afterwards. So I will close with this line from my friend who's about to speak. Resuscitationists make things happen. I can't say it any better than that. So please, consider adopting the mind of the resuscitationist. And with that, I thank you so much for your attention.